You think you can walk into a Hell's Angels garage and decorate our bikes? The laughter hit her like a wall. 68 men, every single one of them staring. And Madison Blake, 22 years old, paint still drying on her hands, didn't flinch. She didn't run. She didn't apologize. She unzipped her portfolio, laid it on that grease-stained table, and said 7 words nobody in that room would ever forget. Give me one bike. I'll prove it. If this story moves you, subscribe, stay until the end, and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The side door of the Hells Angels Riverside chapter garage had not been opened by a stranger in 11 years. The last person who tried a repo man from a dealership 40 minutes north left without his clipboard, without his car, and reportedly without much dignity either. The story had circulated through 3 counties. Nobody tested that door anymore. So when it swung open on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, every head in the building turned. The garage held 68 men that day. Some were working, some were talking, some were doing what bikers do in garages, drinking coffee, arguing about carburetors, reliving stories that got a little bigger every time they were told. The air smelled like motor oil and cigarette smoke and something metallic that never quite went away, no matter how many times the floor got swept. The sound of the door, the specific creak of its hinges, was the kind of sound that made men reach for things without thinking about it. Hands moved, eyes locked onto the entrance. And then they saw her. A young woman, blonde hair pulled back loosely, a worn canvas bag hanging from one shoulder. Paint on her fingers, not a little paint, the kind of paint that meant she'd been working, actually working for hours before she got here. She was wearing jeans and a faded jacket, and she was carrying, of all things, a paintbrush tucked behind her ear like a pen. She was 22 years old. She looked about 17. The garage went completely silent. Not the polite kind of silence, the dangerous kind, the kind that comes right before something happens and nobody's sure yet which direction it's going to go. She stepped onto the concrete floor, and she didn't hesitate. That was the first thing people would remember later, that she didn't hesitate. Most people walking into a room full of 68 Hells Angels would have at least slowed down, would have scanned for exits, would have reconsidered every decision that led them to that moment. Madison Blake walked in like she had an appointment. Jack Ryder Collins was standing near the back of the room beside a partially disassembled engine block. He was 55 years old, 6'2", with a gray beard that had been growing since before this young woman was born. He had spent 3 decades as chapter president. He had seen confrontations, negotiations, threats, and genuinely terrifying situations that he did not discuss in polite company. He looked at the young woman standing in his garage. He looked at the paintbrush behind her ear. His expression didn't change. That was something he had trained himself to do, keep the face neutral while the mind worked. Read the situation. Don't react until you understand what you're reacting to. What he saw was not aggression. What he saw was not someone who had stumbled through the wrong door. What he saw was someone who had walked through the right door on purpose, knowing exactly where they were. That was either impressive or insane. He hadn't decided which yet. One of the younger members, a kid named Danny, who had been patched in 6 months earlier and still hadn't learned when to speak and when to stay quiet, let out a short laugh. "Did someone order entertainment?" he said. Nobody laughed with him. That happened to Danny a lot. The young woman looked at him briefly, then she looked away. Not dismissively, she simply moved her eyes to the rest of the room, taking it in, registering it. Like she was cataloging, like an artist would. She walked another 3 steps into the garage. "My name is Madison Blake," she said. Her voice was steady, not loud. She wasn't performing. She was just speaking clearly enough to be heard across the room. "I'm an artist. I paint motorcycles, custom work, portrait work, memory work. I'm not here to cause any trouble, and I'm not selling anything." She paused. "I'm looking for work, and I'll do the first one free to show you what I can do." The silence stretched. Then Brandon Hayes moved. Brandon was 38 years old and had the particular quality of a man who had spent most of his life being the most physically intimidating person in whatever room he was in, and who had built his entire personality around that fact. He was broad through the shoulders, and his arms had the kind of mass that came from years of actual physical labor, not a gym. He had a reputation in the chapter for being the person Jack sent when subtlety wasn't the priority. He walked toward her slowly, deliberately, the way someone walks when they want you to understand that every step is a choice they're making. He stopped about 4 feet away and looked at the paintbrush behind her ear. You think, he said very quietly, that you can walk into a Hells Angels garage. He let that sit for a second. And decorate our bikes. Madison met his eyes. I don't decorate, she said. I paint. The distinction landed in the room like a coin dropped on tile. Brandon stared at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at the room at the 67 other men watching this exchange, and he let out a laugh, not a warm one. She doesn't decorate, he repeated loud enough for everyone. She paints. The laughter came, not cruel exactly, but not kind either. The kind of laughter that was really a test. That was really a question. Are you going to fall apart right now? Madison didn't fall apart. She unzipped her canvas bag. She didn't rush it. She didn't make a production of it. She simply opened the bag and removed a portfolio, the kind that folds flat, held together with 2 elastic bands, and she walked to the nearest workbench and set it down. Can I show you something? She said. She wasn't asking permission, not exactly. It was more like an invitation, the tone of someone who had something real to offer and was simply offering it. Nobody said no. She unfolded the portfolio. The first page was a motorcycle tank, a custom piece painted in deep burgundy and black with an eagle that seemed to be emerging from the metal itself rather than sitting on top of it. The feathers had individual texture. The eye had a specific quality, not just detail, but something behind the detail. Some sense of intent. Nobody spoke. She turned the page. The second piece was different. A full motorcycle, a Harley older model painted in dark blue with a highway scene that wrapped around the tank and the fenders. But the highway wasn't empty. There were figures on it. A man on a motorcycle in the foreground, and in the distance, barely visible, rendered in the kind of fine strokes that you had to look at carefully to even see a child on a bicycle waving. Frank Dawson, who was standing 6 feet to Madison's left, went very still. Frank was 51. He had lost his son 3 years earlier. Car accident on a Thursday morning, the specific cruelty of it being that his son had been on his way to Frank's garage to help him with a project they'd been working on together. Frank had talked about it exactly once at a chapter meeting and then never again. But the men who'd been in that meeting remembered his face. They remembered the specific quality of his voice when he said his son's name. Frank was looking at the painting of the man on the motorcycle and the child in the distance. He hadn't moved in 30 seconds. Madison turned to the next page. This one was a portrait, not a motorcycle, a person, an older man, maybe 60, sitting on a bike that wasn't running, his hands resting on the handlebars and his eyes looking at something that wasn't in the frame. The painting had the quality of a memory, not perfect, not sharp-edged, but real in the way that memories are real. Emotional, accurate in the ways that matter. Who is that? One of the men asked. My father, Madison said. I painted it 2 months after he died. The room changed. It was subtle, nothing anyone could have pointed to, but the temperature of the air shifted somehow. The kind of shift that happens when a room full of people simultaneously updates their understanding of who they're looking at. Brandon Hayes, who had been leaning against a workbench with his arms crossed and the expression of a man waiting for a reason to stop pretending to be interested, looked at the portrait of the father on the motorcycle. His arms uncrossed. Not dramatically, not all at once. But they uncrossed. Jack Ryder had crossed the room during the portfolio viewing. He hadn't made a show of it. He'd simply moved gradually until he was close enough to see. He was looking at the portrait now. What happened to him? Jack asked. His voice was neutral. Not cold, just careful. The way you speak when you're asking a real question and you actually want the answer. Heart, Madison said, 6 months ago. She looked at the portrait for a second. He was a motorcycle mechanic, painter. He taught me both. She looked up at Jack. He used to say that every machine has a story, that the job wasn't to put something pretty on metal. The mod was to find the story that was already there and bring it out where people could see it. Jack held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked at the portfolio, at the eagle that seemed to breathe, at the highway that seemed to go somewhere real, at the father's hands on the handlebars. You painted all of these yourself, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, sir. On actual bikes, not canvas. On actual bikes. Canvas is just where I practice. Brandon was still looking at the father portrait. He had the expression of a man who had been ready to say something cutting and had forgotten what it was. How long have you been doing this? He asked. His voice was different now. Not warm. Brandon Hayes was not a warm man, but the performance quality had gone out of it. He was asking because he actually wanted to know. Since I was 9, Madison said. My dad let me paint my first tank when I was 9. I ruined it completely. She paused. He kept it anyway, hung it on the wall of his shop. Something moved across Frank Dawson's face. He looked away for a second. Jack Ryder made a decision. He looked around the room at his chapter at 67 men who were standing in various postures of skepticism and reluctant curiosity, and then he looked back at the young woman with paint on her hands and a dead father's lessons in her portfolio. He walked to the far corner of the garage to a workbench where a motorcycle tank sat unfinished. It had been there for 3 weeks. The previous painter had started a project and then backed out, said the client's vision was too specific, too demanding, that he couldn't get it right. The client had been Jack himself. He picked up the tank and carried it to the central table. He set it down. 2 hours, he said. Madison looked at the tank. 2 hours, Jack repeated. You paint something that means something, not something that looks like something, something that means something. He looked at her directly. If your work is worth remembering, we'll talk. If it isn't, you walk away and we forget this happened. The room had gone completely quiet again. Madison looked at the tank for a long moment. She ran her hand along the surface, not the paint surface, the metal underneath, feeling the seams, the curves, the specific geography of it. What do you want it to say? She asked. I want it to say what it needs to say, Jack answered. That's your job. I told you, find the story that's already there. She looked up at him. Fair enough, she said. She opened her bag. Nobody knew it then. Standing in that garage with the smell of oil and the distant sound of traffic from the highway outside. But what happened in the next 2 hours was going to change every single person in that room. Not all at once, not dramatically, but permanently. Madison cleared a space on the workbench. She did it efficiently and without asking, moved a wrench, a coffee mug, a rag that had been sitting there long enough to belong to no one, and set the tank in the center of the cleared space. Then she opened her bag and began laying out her materials. This was the second thing people would remember later. Not the painting itself, the preparation before the painting, the deliberateness of it, the way she handled each tool like it had a specific purpose and she knew exactly what that purpose was. She had 3 brushes in different sizes, small bottles of paint, not spray, not the kind that came in aerosol cans, but fine quality artist paint in small glass bottles. A cleaning cloth, a small jar of a preparatory solution that she applied to the tank surface, first working it in with the cloth in slow, careful circles. Danny, the young member who'd made the entertainment comment earlier, drifted toward the workbench and leaned against the one next to it. He was trying to look like he wasn't watching. He was watching. You really think 2 hours is enough, he said. Madison didn't look up from the surface she was preparing. Depends on what you're trying to say, she said. What are you trying to say? She was quiet for a moment. I don't know yet, she said. I'm listening. Danny blinked. Listening to what? To the bike. He looked at her like she'd said something strange. Then he looked at the tank, then back at her. He didn't say anything else, but he didn't leave either. The bikers in the garage had gradually redistributed themselves. Nobody had made a decision to gather around the workbench. It just happened the way things happen in rooms when something interesting is occurring, and people don't want to admit they're interested. Men who had been working on projects across the garage had found reasons to be on this side of the room. Men who had been sitting in the office doorway had drifted out. Even Brandon Hayes, who had retreated to a stool near the tool wall, was positioned at an angle that put the workbench directly in his line of sight. Madison began to paint. The first stroke was a line, just a line horizontal, thin, placed about 1/3 of the way up the tank. It was the kind of stroke you make when you know where you're going. Not tentative, not exploratory, deliberate. What is that? Someone asked. A road, Madison said. She kept painting. The line became a road. The road gained texture, not flat, not decorative, but the specific texture of asphalt that has been lived on. That has been ridden. That has absorbed the history of the vehicles that passed over it. Frank Dawson had moved to a position about 10 feet from the workbench. He was watching the road appear on the metal surface, and his jaw was set in the particular way it's set when he was keeping something contained. 18 minutes in Madison added the sky. Not blue, not the ordinary blue that painters default to when they paint sky. She used a specific tone that was somewhere between early morning and late evening, The color of a sky that you see from a motorcycle when you've been riding long enough. That time stops mattering when the road is what's real and everything else is peripheral. One of the older members, a man named Gene, who had been with the chapter for 22 years and who was not known for commenting on aesthetics, said quietly to no one in particular, "That's the right color." Nobody responded, but two men near him nodded. 35 minutes and the first figure appeared. It came out of Madison's brush in a series of strokes that shouldn't have added up to a person, and somehow did. A rider on a motorcycle in the middle distance of the road, moving away from the viewer. Not posed, not heroic, just riding the specific posture of a man who has been on a motorcycle so long that the machine and the body have stopped being separate things. The garage was completely silent. Someone's phone buzzed. Nobody looked at it. 48 minutes in, Brandon Hayes got off his stool. He walked to within 6 feet of the workbench. He stood there with his arms crossed, but differently. Now, not the defensive crossing of a man performing skepticism, but the unself-conscious crossing of a man who has forgotten he's supposed to have an opinion about this and has just started looking. He watched Madison work for 3 minutes without speaking. Then he said, "My dad rode." He didn't say it to anyone. He just said it, like he'd been holding it and it had gotten too heavy. Madison kept painting, but she said, "What kind of bike was Sportster 79? Did he teach you?" A pause. Golf bus. Moishi, some, do you still ride his? A longer pause. He still has it. Madison mixed a color, a dark, specific tone that took her 40 seconds to get right, adding a drop of something, then a drop of something else, checking it against the light. "The good ones stay," she said quietly. "The bikes, I mean. They outlast almost everything." Brandon said nothing, but his arms uncrossed. He pulled up a stool and sat down, 3 feet from the workbench, watching. At the 1 hour mark, Jack Ryder came to look. He stood behind Madison and he looked at the tank, and he was quiet for a long time. The road was there, the sky was there, the rider was there, and Madison was adding something new, something in the foreground, something that the viewer was seeing from a pair of hands on handlebars. Your hands, you were the viewer, and you were riding too, and in the distance, the other rider was there, and the road between you and him was simultaneously very short and very long. Jack Ryder put his hands in his pockets. He looked at the painting for a long time. He said nothing. Madison kept working. At 1 hour and 22 minutes, Frank Dawson walked to the far side of the garage. He stood near the back wall for a while. Gene drifted over to him and stood nearby, not saying anything. The specific companionship of men who have known each other long enough, that proximity is enough. At 1 hour and 44 minutes, Madison added the last element. It was small, easy to miss. In the very top corner of the tank, barely visible against the sky, a bird. A hawk maybe, or an eagle, not rendered in detail, suggested. The kind of mark that made you wonder if it was there at all until you looked more carefully and realized it had been there the whole time, that you'd simply been looking at the road. She set her brush down. She stepped back. She said, "I'm done." The garage was silent. Jack came forward and looked at the tank from 3 feet away, then 2 feet. Then he crouched slightly and looked at it from the side, the way you look at a painting when you want to understand the layers. He stood up. He looked at Madison. He looked back at the tank. Brandon Hayes was standing next to him now, and the two of them looked at the painting together for a long moment. The road and the sky and the rider and the hands and the bird in the corner and the specific quality of the light that Gene had identified as right. Brandon cleared his throat. He said, "Who taught you?" Madison looked at him. She looked at the tank. She looked at the worn-out portfolio sitting on the workbench beside her materials, with the portrait of the older man with his hands on the handlebars and his eyes looking at something outside the frame. "My father," she said. The word landed in the room with a specific weight. Not just the word, the context of it. The father who was gone. The father who had spent years teaching her that machines carry stories. The father whose hands she had painted from memory. The father who had kept her ruined first tank on the wall of his shop because it was hers, because she had made it, because the work itself mattered regardless of whether it was perfect. The father who had told her 6 months ago, in what turned out to be one of their last real conversations, "Your hands can create something nobody can destroy." And here she was in a Hells Angels garage with 68 men staring at her and at the motorcycle tanks she'd just painted in 1 hour and 44 minutes, proving him right. Frank Dawson came back from the wall. He stood in front of the tank for a long time. He removed his sunglasses, folded them, and put them in his pocket. The deliberate act of a man who wanted to see something clearly. He looked at the road, at the rider in the distance, at the hands in the foreground, at the bird in the corner that might have been there the whole time, or might have appeared only when you were ready to see it. Nobody said anything, which was in the specific context of that garage, and those 68 men more significant than anything anyone could have said. Jack Ryder walked back to his usual position near the center of the room. He was quiet for a moment, and the room waited. He looked at Madison. "You said your father passed 6 months ago." "Yes. And before that, how long were you working together, I mean? How long did he teach you?" Madison thought about this for a second, not because she didn't know the answer, because she was measuring it properly. 13 years, she said. "I was 9 the first time. I'm 22 now. 13 years. Yes." Jack nodded slowly. He looked around at the men in his chapter. He looked at the tank on the workbench. He looked at Brandon, who was still standing near the workbench and who had the expression of a man quietly revising something. He looked at Frank, who was still looking at the painting. He looked at Danny, who was sitting on a stool with his elbows on his knees and his chin on his hands, watching Madison with the open expression of someone who has had an assumption corrected and is still processing the correction. He looked back at Madison. "There's a bike in the back," he said. "Been sitting there for about a year. Owner wants something specific, not decorative," he said. "Meaningful. He's been waiting for the right person." Madison waited. "Come back tomorrow morning," Jack said. 8 o'clock. I'll introduce you." Madison reached for her portfolio. She folded it and put it back in her bag. She capped her paint bottles and laid her brushes carefully into their case. She picked up her cleaning cloth and wiped down the workbench, not because it was expected, but because it was her workspace, and that's how she left workspaces. She picked up her bag. She looked at the tank on the table at the road, and the rider in the sky, and the bird that might have always been there. She looked at Jack. 8 o'clock, she said. She walked back to the side door, the same door she'd opened 2 hours ago when the whole garage had turned around and the silence had gone dangerous, and a young kid named Danny had asked if someone had ordered entertainment. She pushed it open. The afternoon light came in for a moment. Then the door closed behind her. The garage stayed quiet. Brandon Hayes looked at the motorcycle tank for another long moment. Then he said to no one in particular, which from Brandon was approximately the equivalent of a standing ovation. Gene, who had been with the chapter for 22 years and who was not known for editorial commentary, looked at the door where Madison had exited and then looked at Jack. "Good call," he said. Jack didn't respond. But he looked at the tank one more time, at the hands on the handlebars, at the rider in the distance, at the road that went on past the edge of the metal, as though it continued somewhere the painting couldn't follow, and something moved across his face. Not many people would have recognized it. Jack Ryder was not a man who let things show easily. But Frank Dawson, who was standing close enough and who had known Jack for 19 years, recognized it. It was the specific expression of a man who has been reminded of something he thought he'd forgotten. Frank put his sunglasses back on. He walked back to his workbench. And in the Hells Angels Riverside chapter garage, for the first time in a very long time, the silence after a stranger left was not the silence of a warning. It was the silence of people thinking. She came back at 7:58. Jack noticed because he was standing near the window with his coffee when her truck pulled into the lot, and he checked his watch out of habit, and the watch said 7:58. 2 minutes early, he filed that away. Brandon was already in the garage when Madison walked through the side door. He had arrived at 7:30, which was earlier than his usual time, and he had not offered an explanation for this to anyone. He was working on a carburetor and not looking up when the door opened, but the carburetor work slowed down noticeably when Madison walked in. She set her bag on the same workbench she'd used the day before. She didn't say good morning like she was announcing it. She said it the way you say it to people you've already established something with, a word dropped into the room, easy and natural, not asking for anything. A few men responded. Brandon grunted. That was more than he gave most people. Frank Dawson came in at 8:03. He looked at Madison. He looked at the workbench where the tank from yesterday still sat. Jack had left it there, hadn't moved it to the display shelf or the storage room or anywhere else, just left it on the table where she'd painted it. Frank looked at the tank for a moment and then looked at his coffee cup and walked to his usual spot. Jack came out of the office at 8:05 and said, "Follow me." The bike in the back was a 1987 Harley-Davidson Softail. It had been sitting under a canvas cover for 14 months. The owner, a member named Roy Garrett, who had been out of state dealing with a family situation and hadn't been to the chapter in nearly a year, had called Jack 6 weeks earlier and said he wanted something done with it. He'd been specific about what he didn't want. He didn't want flames, didn't want skulls, didn't want anything that looked like what it was trying to look like. He wanted something real. He said he'd know it when he saw it. Jack pulled the cover off. The bike was in decent shape mechanically. The paint was factory stock black, clean. Nothing remarkable about it. Madison walked around it slowly, not performing the inspection, actually doing it. She crouched beside the rear fender. She stood and looked at the tank from above. She ran her hand along the length of the frame. "What happened to his family?" she asked. Jack looked at her. "His son," Jack said, 18, accident on the highway. Madison was still looking at the bike. She didn't respond immediately. She kept her hand on the frame. "Went 14 months ago." She was quiet for a moment. "Has Roy talked about what he wants?" "I told you what he said, real. He wants it to mean something." "But has he talked about his son?" Jack paused. "Some." "I need to hear it," Madison said. She finally looked up at Jack. "Why the summary, the actual thing? What he told you about his son specifically?" Jack studied her for a second. "Roy said his son used to ride with him," he said. "Not often. The kid was 18, had his own life going. But whenever they rode together, Roy said his son always pushed ahead, always had to be out front. Roy would look up, and there he was out ahead, and Roy said the thing he remembers most is not being able to see his face, just his back. His son always riding out ahead." Madison was very still. "Always out ahead," she repeated quietly. "That's what Roy said." She looked at the tank. Something shifted in her expression, the specific shift of someone who has just found the thing they were looking for. "Okay," she said. "I need 4 days." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Roy's coming back in 5. "Then I have 4 days," she said. Jack looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded and walked back toward the front of the garage. Madison stayed with the bike. She pulled a small notebook from her bag. Not a portfolio, just a worn spiral notebook, and she sat on an overturned bucket and she wrote for 20 minutes. Nobody bothered her. Word had traveled through the chapter faster than anyone had announced it. She's doing Roy's bike. Men found reasons to be in the back section of the garage. They were quieter than usual. Danny came and stood nearby after about 40 minutes. He watched her sketch in the notebook. The sketches were not detailed drawings, they were more like diagrams, lines and shapes and notations, the language of someone thinking through a problem. "What does it feel like?" Danny asked. Madison didn't look up. What does what feel like painting something for someone you've never met? When they're going through something like that. She was quiet for a moment. "Like being trusted with something fragile," she said. "The kind of fragile that doesn't look fragile from the outside." Danny thought about that. He sat down on an empty crate. "My grandfather rode," he said. "He died when I was 12. I never told anyone in the chapter because I figured they'd think I was just..." He stopped. "I don't know. Trying to seem like I belonged." Madison looked up at him for the first time. "Did you belong?" she asked. He blinked. "What? Before your grandfather? Did you belong before you knew he rode?" Danny was quiet. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." "Then you weren't trying to seem like anything," she said. "You were just carrying 2 things at once and only showing one of them." Danny didn't respond for a long time. Then he said quietly, "Yeah, that's exactly what it was." Madison went back to her notebook. Danny stayed on the crate for another hour, not saying anything, watching her work through the design in her sketches. He would tell people later, much later, after all of it had happened, that the hour he spent sitting on that crate, watching her plan a painting for a grieving father he'd never met, was one of the most clarifying hours he had spent in the chapter. He couldn't explain why. He just knew that something about watching someone take grief seriously, treat it with precision and care and actual thought, made him understand what the chapter was supposed to be about in a way that 3 years of membership had not quite managed to teach him. Brandon Hayes came to the back section at mid-morning. He pretended he needed a specific wrench from the tool chest near the back wall. He spent 4 minutes finding the wrench. The tool chest was not that complicated. He glanced at Madison's notebook. He saw the rough sketch. A motorcycle in the distance moving away. Behind it, another motorcycle closer to the viewer looking after the one ahead. The specific visual of one rider watching another ride out in front. Brandon's jaw tightened. He found the wrench. He stood there for a second. Then he said without looking at Madison directly, "Roy's going to need a minute when he sees it." Madison kept writing in her notebook. "I know," she said. Brandon walked away. At 12:30, Jean brought Madison a cup of coffee without asking if she wanted one. He set it on the corner of the workbench nearest to her and walked away. Madison looked at the coffee and then looked at Jean's retreating back and said, "Thank you." Jean waved a hand over his shoulder without turning around, the gesture of a man who does not require acknowledgement for basic human decency. She started the first layer of primer that afternoon. The work was methodical. She mixed the preparatory coat carefully and applied it in long, even strokes, building the base before any color touched the metal. 3 men watched her do this without speaking. The primer was not visually interesting. It was gray and flat and unremarkable. But she applied it with the same focus she'd given to every stroke of the finished painting the day before. And the men watching understood, in the way you understand things you've learned through physical work yourself, that this was not separate from the painting. This was the painting, the invisible layer that everything else would stand on. By 4 o'clock, the base was done. She covered the tank with a clean cloth and began cleaning up her workspace. Jack came back to the work area. He stood near the bike for a moment. "Same time tomorrow," he said. 7:30, she said. "I need more time tomorrow." He nodded. Then he said without particularly leading up to it, "Where are you from, Madison?" She stopped packing her brushes for a second. "Here," she said. "Riverside, born here, mostly raised here." She paused. "My dad's shop was on Magnolia. He had it for 18 years. Jack went still. "Blake's Motorcycles," he said. Madison looked at him. "You knew it," she said. "Tom Blake," Jack said quietly. "Tom Blake was your father." The garage, or at least the section of it near the back where 3 men were still working and pretending not to listen, went very quiet. "You knew him," Madison said. "It was not a question." "He worked on 2 of my bikes," Jack said, 14 years ago, maybe 15, before we had our own mechanic on chapter. I used to bring them to his shop. He paused. He was looking at Madison with a different expression now, not recalibrating exactly but expanding. Like a photograph developing. "He was the best mechanic I ever paid for work," he said. And he talked about his daughter. Madison's hands had gone still on her brush case. "He talked about her like she was—" Jack stopped. He was not a man who reached for words carelessly, and he was reaching for the right one. "Like she was the most important project he'd ever worked on," he said finally, "and everything else was just practice." The silence stretched. Madison looked down at her brush case. She closed it slowly. She picked up her bag. When she looked up again, her eyes were bright, but her expression was steady, the specific steadiness of someone who has had a lot of practice holding things together in public. "He never told me he knew you," she said. "I don't know that he would have," Jack said. "Tom was private about the bikers he respected. He didn't advertise it." "No," she said softly. "He wouldn't have." She picked up her bag. 7:30, she said. 7:30. Jack agreed. She walked to the side door. She pushed it open. This time 3 men looked up as she left. Not with the suspicion of yesterday, with the particular attention of people watching someone they have started without quite deciding to care about. The door closed. Jack stood where he was for a long moment. Brandon appeared from somewhere near the tool chest, the wrench he'd retrieved 2 hours ago somehow back in his hand. "Tom Blake," Brandon said. "Yeah," Jack said. "I remember that shop." Brandon was quiet for a second. "He had a painting on the wall, above the tire rack. Big one. Eagle with the wings spread." "That was hers," Jack said. "He told me. His daughter painted it. She was 11. Brandon looked at the covered motorcycle tank. He looked at the door where Madison had exited. He said, again, but differently. The next morning she arrived at 7:27. She went straight to the back section. The canvas was already off the tank. Jean had taken it off at 7:15 before she arrived, which was a small gesture, but specific in the way that small, specific gestures are in places where people don't often make gestures at all. She started the color work. The first color she mixed was a particular shade of blue-gray, not decorative, not symbolic, just correct. The color of early morning light hitting asphalt in the specific way it hits in the Inland Empire, where the air is dry and the light comes in low and turns everything slightly silver before the day heats up and bleaches it back to ordinary. Jean, who had been doing mechanical work 6 feet away, stopped what he was doing when she put the first color on. He didn't say anything. He just stopped working. Frank Dawson came by at 9 o'clock and stood near the workbench for about 3 minutes and then walked away. He came back at 10:30 and stood for 6 minutes. He didn't say anything either time, but the second time he came back, he moved slightly closer. Not intrusively, just close enough to see the work properly. Brandon arrived mid-morning and positioned himself on his stool, the one he'd pulled up during her first session, which had been left in that same position, as if by unspoken agreement. He watched her work for 40 minutes in silence. Then he said, "The one that's behind, the one watching, is that Roy? Or is that the viewer?" Madison kept painting. "Both," she said. Brandon thought about that. "So whoever's looking at the bike is also in the painting," he said. "Yes." He was quiet again. "That's smart," he said. "It was my father's idea," Madison said. "He said the best paintings on bikes are the ones where the rider becomes part of the story just by riding. So the painting changes depending on who's on the bike." Brandon turned that over. "The painting he gave you," Brandon said. "The last one before he died. Was it like that?" Madison set her brush down. She looked at Brandon. He met her eyes without looking away, which was not something Brandon Hayes did with most people. He had a habit of using sustained eye contact as a form of pressure. This was not that. This was something else, the specific eye contact of a man asking a real question and wanting a real answer. "He didn't give me a painting," she said. "He gave me instructions." "What kind of instructions?" She picked her brush back up. "The kind I'm following right now," she said. Brandon nodded slowly. He didn't ask anything else. He sat on his stool and watched her paint for another hour, and his arms stayed uncrossed the entire time, and nobody pointed this out because they didn't need to. The second day's work covered the main scene, the two riders, the road, the specific quality of distance between them. That was not separation, but perspective. That the one in front was not gone, just ahead. That the one behind was not left behind, just watching. That the road connected them in both directions, and the direction you looked determined what the painting meant. And it meant something different depending on when you looked at it and what you were carrying at the time. At 2 in the afternoon, something happened that no one was quite prepared for. A man walked in through the front entrance of the garage, not the side door, the front, and he was not a member and no one had cleared him. He was tall, maybe 45, in a dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and he was carrying a leather portfolio that was much more expensive looking than Madison's worn canvas one. 2 members moved to intercept him immediately. He held up his hand and said his name was Harris, and he was looking for the young artist he'd heard she was doing custom work here, and he represented a client who was very interested. Jack came out of the office. The man named Harris explained fluently and efficiently that he represented a motorcycle accessories company, Apex Customs, out of Los Angeles, and that his client had seen photographs of Madison's work that had been circulating on a motorcycle enthusiast forum online. Someone in the chapter had posted images of the tank from the first session, and those images had moved quickly through several communities. His client was very interested in discussing a licensing arrangement. Jack listened to all of this. He looked at Harris. "She's working," he said. "I can wait," Harris said. "She's working," Jack repeated. "And this isn't a gallery. Come back when she's ready to talk." Harris opened his mouth. One of the members near him, a large man named Carver, who did not have to do much to communicate that the conversation was over, stepped slightly closer. Harris left a business card and departed. Jack took the business card to the back section where Madison was working. He set it on the corner of the workbench. Madison looked at it. She looked at the company name. She kept painting. "You know them?" Jack asked. "No," she said. "You want to talk to them?" She was quiet for a moment. "Not yet," she said. Jack nodded. He picked up the card and walked back to the office. But something about the visit sat in the room after Harris left. A faint change in atmosphere, like the air pressure shift before weather comes. Madison felt it. She kept her focus on the tank, but she felt it, the specific unease of being noticed by the wrong kind of attention. Her father had warned her about this. specifically precisely with the careful tone he used when he was telling her something he wanted to make sure she remembered. When someone says they love your work, he'd told her, the first question is always, what do they love about it? The work or what the work can do for them. Those are two completely different things, Madison learned to tell the difference early. She had thought about that often in the 6 months since he died. She thought about it now. She kept painting. By the end of the second day, the main scene was 60% complete. She covered it again and cleaned her workspace and said goodnight to the 4 men still in the garage, and each of them said goodnight back, which was something. Brandon said it without the grunt. That was progress. The third day was the detail work. This was the part of the process that other painters sometimes skip, the layer of small strokes and fine adjustments that most people never consciously noticed, but that everyone felt. The difference between a painting that looked like something and a painting that felt like something. It was slow. It required a smaller brush and a steadier hand, and the specific patience of someone who understood that the invisible work was the most important work. Danny came and sat on his crate again. He'd made it a habit now. He showed up in the morning, did his chapter work, and then found time to come to the back section and sit near Madison's workbench. He didn't talk much during these sessions. He watched. At mid-morning of the third day, he said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask," Madison said. "When did you know this was what you were supposed to do, like really know?" She was adding detail to the shadow rider, the one in the distance, the one who was out ahead. Fine strokes that gave the shadow depth without making it solid. The suggestion of a person who was there enough to matter, but not so there that you could quite hold on to them. "I was 13, she said. "There was a man who came to my dad's shop. He had a bike that had belonged to his wife. She died the year before. He wanted something painted on it, but he couldn't explain what. He kept starting sentences and not finishing them. My dad talked to him for 2 hours, just talked. And then he called me in and said, 'You know what to paint.' And I did know." She paused. "I don't know how to explain that. I just knew. The same way you know a word in a language you didn't think you spoke." Danny was quiet. "What did you paint?" he asked. "Her hands," Madison said. She'd been a gardener. Her husband said that every time he closed his eyes and tried to picture her, what he saw was her hands in the dirt. She kept working. "I painted her hands on the tank, reaching down towards something that was just out of frame, like she was still tending something, still working." The back section of the garage was very quiet. Frank Dawson, who had been pretending to inventory a parts shelf 6 feet away, had stopped moving. Danny's voice when he found it was careful. "What did the man say when he saw it?" "He didn't say anything for a long time," Madison said. "And then he said, 'That's her.' And my dad looked at me and he nodded once." She paused. "That was better than anything anyone has ever said about my work." Frank put down the part he was holding. He walked away quietly. Jean watched him go and looked at Madison and then looked away. The detail work took most of the third day. By 4 o'clock, Madison had reached the final element, the small, almost invisible detail that she added last to everything she painted. Not a signature in the conventional sense, but something specific to her father. He had started the practice, and she had continued it in every painting. Somewhere in the composition, there was a small mark. Not hidden exactly, just subtle, a detail that required looking to find. He'd called it the proof of care, the idea that if you look closely enough, you'd find evidence of the full attention that had gone into the work. On Roy's tank, the mark was in the shadow of the lead rider. In the rider's shadow on the road, if you looked at exactly the right angle, in exactly the right light, there was the faint suggestion of a hand. Open, palm up, not grasping, not waving, just open, like an offering or a greeting or a goodbye that wasn't final. Jean, who had come to look at the nearly finished work, stared at that section of the painting for a long time. "What is that?" he said finally. "What do you see?" Madison asked. He looked again. "A hand," he said. "Whose?" He thought about it. "The kid's," he said finally. "Roy's son." He looked at Madison. "Isn't it? It's whoever Roy needs it to be," she said. Jean looked at the painting for another moment. He put his hand on his chest briefly, not dramatically. Just a small private gesture there, and then gone, and then he walked back to his workbench. Brandon Hayes came to look at the finished work at end of day. He stood in front of the tank for a long time. He didn't speak for 3 minutes. Madison timed it more or less because she was cleaning her brushes and the silence was specific and she wanted to let it be what it was. Finally, he said, Roy's going to decree to him. I know, she said. Roy doesn't cry, Brandon said. I've known Roy for 11 years. He doesn't cry. Madison looked at the painting. He will when he sees this, she said simply. Brandon looked at her. Not with the defensive skepticism of that first day. Not with the performing appraisal of a man deciding whether to be impressed. He looked at her the way people look at other people when they have genuinely revised their understanding and want to be honest about it. Yeah, he said. He will. He walked back to his usual side of the garage. Madison finished cleaning her brushes. She covered the tank with a clean cloth. She picked up her bag. Jack was standing near the office doorway. Roy comes in day after tomorrow, he said. I know, she said. It'll be ready. She started toward the door. Jack said, Madison. She stopped. He was looking at her with the careful, measured expression of a man who does not offer things lightly. Your father would have been proud of that bike, he said. She looked at him. She didn't say anything for a second. Then she said, he would have found 3 things to fix. Jack's mouth moved not quite a smile, but in the direction of one. Yeah, he said, probably. She went home. The garage stayed open for another 3 hours. The men who remained worked with the particular focused quality of people who have had something move through their meal and are still feeling the movement. Nobody put music on. Nobody argued about carburetors. Nobody told a story that got bigger than it started. They just worked in the specific companionable silence of people who have found themselves without quite planning it in the middle of something that matters. At 9 o'clock, Brandon Hayes walked past Roy's covered bike on his way to the exit. He stopped. He stood there for a moment. He reached out and very briefly, without drama, put his hand on the covered tank, just rested it there for a second, the way you'd touch something that was asking to be acknowledged, and then he dropped his hand and walked out. Nobody saw it, but it happened. And somewhere in the quality of that small private gesture was everything that Madison Blake had walked through the side door 2 days ago to say, without knowing yet that she was saying it, that every machine has a story, and sometimes the job of a painter is simply to find the courage to tell the truth about what the story is and trust the people listening to already know the words. Roy Garrett pulled into the lot at 11:14 on a Friday morning. Jack knew he was coming because Roy had called from the road somewhere outside of Barstow and said he'd be there before noon. Jack had told Madison at 8 o'clock when she arrived, and she had spent the morning making small adjustments to the tank, that she hadn't been satisfied with 2 areas where the color transition wasn't quite doing what she needed it to do. She fixed them. Then she stood back and looked at the work for a long time and fixed one more thing. Then she covered it and stepped away because she had learned from her father that there was a point past which more work was not improvement but anxiety, and the job was to know the difference. The garage had a different quality that morning. The men felt Roy coming the way you feel, whether not dramatically, not with fanfare, but as a change in the air, that your body registers before your mind catches up. Roy had been absent for 14 months. That was a long time in a chapter where presence was everything. People had covered for him, checked on him, sent messages that mostly went unanswered. They understood. Grief does not follow chapter schedules, but 14 months was a long time. And the man who was pulling into that lot was not the same man who had left, and everyone in the garage knew it without having discussed it, the way you know things in groups that operate on loyalty and time. Roy was 53. He'd been with the chapter for 19 years. He was medium height, lean in the way that some men get lean when they stop eating properly and start moving through days on momentum instead of intention. He had dark eyes that had always been sharp and were still sharp, but had the specific quality now of sharp things that have been through something, a keenness that was also a kind of wariness, like a man who had learned that paying close attention didn't always protect you. He came through the front entrance, and the room did the thing it does when someone returns after a real absence, the particular recalibration of people updating their mental image of someone against the actual person standing in front of them. Brandon shook Roy's hand and held it an extra second. Jean clapped him on the shoulder and said his name once, firmly the way you say someone's name, when the point is just the name itself. Frank Dawson looked at Roy from across the room and nodded, and Roy nodded back, and in that exchange was a conversation that neither of them could have had out loud. Jack came out of the office and said, Good to have you back. Roy said, good to be somewhere. Which was honest in the way that only people who have spent time not being anywhere can be honest. Danny, who was standing near the back section doorway, looked at Roy and then at Madison, who had stayed near the covered tank and was being very still in the specific way of someone who understands that this moment is not about them. Roy looked at the canvas-covered object on the workbench in the back section. He looked at Jack. Jack said, come on back. They walked together, Roy, Jack, and the quiet drift of several men who followed without being invited and without being told not to. Brandon, Gene, Frank, Danny standing in the doorway where the front section met the back. The chapter assembling itself around this moment, the way water finds its level naturally without instruction. Madison was standing to the side of the workbench. Roy looked at her. This is Madison Blake, Jack said. Tom Blake's daughter. She did the work. Roy's eyes moved to Madison with a different quality when Jack said Tom Blake's name recognition or the edge of that. I knew Tom, Roy said. I know, Madison said. Jack told me. Roy looked at the covered tank. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, can I, and didn't finish the sentence, but the gesture of his hand toward the canvas completed it. Madison nodded. Roy reached out and took the edge of the canvas and pulled it back slowly. The room stayed very quiet. Roy looked at his motorcycle tank for a long time. The road, the light, the rider in the distance pushing ahead, always out front, the specific posture of a young man who rode like the horizon owed him something. And behind the viewer, the one watching, the one whose hands were on the bars and whose eyes were always on that figure ahead, watching him go, watching him always just out in front. And in the shadow of the lead rider, if you looked at exactly the right angle in exactly the right light, the open hand. Roy stood very still. His jaw worked. Nobody spoke. Brandon was watching Roy's face, and his own face was doing something that Brandon's face did not usually do. It was open, unguarded. The expression of a man watching another man carry something unbearable and feeling the weight of it himself. 40 seconds passed. A minute. Roy said very quietly, he's still out front. Madison said yes. Roy's eyes were wet. He didn't wipe them. He stood there with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes on the painting and the tears on his face, and he was not ashamed of them, and nobody in that room would have allowed themselves to notice them in any way that cost Roy anything. He always had to be out front, Roy said. His voice was low and unsteady, but he kept talking the way people talk when they have needed to say something for a very long time. I used to get frustrated with him. I used to think, just ride with me, just for once, just stay beside me. But he couldn't. It wasn't disrespect. He had somewhere to be. He was always going somewhere. He stopped. I didn't understand that until he was gone. That it wasn't about me. He was just that kind of person. The kind who's always a little ahead. Madison was very still. Roy looked at the open hand in the shadow. What is that? He said. What do you see? She said. He looked at it for a long time. He's waving, Roy said. He's looking back and waving. Is that okay? She said quietly. Roy's breath came out unsteady. Yeah, he said. Yeah, he stopped. He put his hand over his mouth for a second. That's exactly right, he said. He looked at Madison, then really looked at her, the way you look at someone who has given you something you didn't know how to ask for. How did you know? He said. Jack told me your son always rode ahead, she said. And I thought about what it means to watch someone ride ahead, not to be left behind to watch someone go. There's a difference. Roy looked at the painting again. There is a difference, he said, and his voice had something in it now. Not less grief, but grief with a slight shift in it, like furniture that has been moved an inch, and suddenly the room breathes differently. Nobody spoke for a while. Then Roy looked around at the men who had gathered Brandon, Gene, Frank, Danny in the doorway, and he looked at Jack and he said, thank you. Not for any specific thing, for everything the word could carry. Jack said, she did the work. Roy looked at Madison. Your father, he said, he used to talk about you in the shop. Every time I brought a bike in, he'd find a way to mention his daughter. Madison's expression held. What did he say? She asked. Roy thought about it. He said you were going to do something nobody expected, he said. He said you had the thing that couldn't be taught. He used to say, Roy paused, recalling it carefully. He used to say that most painters learn to put things on metal. But Madison, he said, Madison learned to take things out of it. Like the story was already in there and she just found it. The room was completely quiet. Madison looked down for a second. 1 second, no more. Then she looked up. He never told me he said that, she said. Sounds like Tom, Roy said gently. She nodded once. She picked up her brush case and her bag, and she gave Roy the space to be with his bike, because the painting was his now, and this moment was his, and her job in it was finished. She was almost to the doorway when Roy said her name. She stopped. I want to tell people about your work, he said. I want people to see this. Madison turned back. You don't have to do anything, she said. I know I don't have to, Roy said. I want to. She held his gaze for a moment. Okay, she said. She walked out. What Roy did next, he did that afternoon, sitting at a table in the chapter's back room with a cup of coffee that went cold while he typed. He posted 3 photographs of the tank to an online motorcycle forum where he'd been a member for 9 years. He wrote maybe 4 sentences about where the work had come from and who had done it. He was not a man given to long public statements. 4 sentences was for Roy an oration. By that evening, the post had been shared 47 times. By the following morning, 212. By the end of the week, the photographs had traveled to 3 different motorcycle communities, 2 general interest pages, and a photography forum where someone had cropped the image of the open hand in the shadow and posted it separately with the caption, "Look at this detail." That cropped image alone was shared over 800 times. Madison didn't know any of this at first. She didn't have accounts on those platforms. She was not a person who tracked her own presence online. She knew Roy's tank was finished, and Roy had seen it, and something important had happened in that back section of the garage, and that was what she had come to do, so she considered that chapter closed. She was wrong. 2 days after Roy's visit, a woman named Carla Jimenez came to the garage. She was 44, a rider herself, and she had seen the photographs online. She wanted Madison to paint her bike. She'd been riding for 12 years, and her bike had a story, and she'd never been able to find anyone who could tell it right. Then a man named David Park, who had ridden from Pomona, showed up the following Tuesday. His daughter had taken a photograph of Roy's tank on the forum and sent it to him with a message that just said, "Dad." This is what I mean. He had called his daughter that night, and they had talked for the first time in a real way in 2 years. He came to the garage with a photo of his daughter printed on paper, folded in his jacket pocket, and he asked Madison if she could put something on his tank that told the story of why riding had always been how he thought about her freedom and distance, and something that kept moving even when it scared him. Madison said yes. She said yes to both of them. She said yes to the man who came the following week with his father's old Sportster and no clear idea of what he wanted, but a feeling he couldn't name. She said yes to the woman who came with her late sister's photograph and sat at the workbench and talked for 40 minutes before Madison touched a brush, because Madison always listened before she worked. The garage changed. Not in any planned way, not because anyone made a decision about it, but the work that was happening in the back section was changing the atmosphere of the front section in the way that certain things change rooms gradually, then suddenly, then you couldn't quite remember what it had been like before. Jack watched this happen. He watched it carefully. He was a man who had spent 30 years running an organization that required him to understand dynamics, how things shifted, what accelerated change, and what stabilized it, when to let something develop and when to intervene. He watched Madison's presence in the garage and what it was doing to the chapter, and he made a decision. He didn't announce the decision. He simply cleared an area in the back section, moved 2 tool chests to the wall, and brought in a work table that was wider and better lit than the one she'd been using. Madison arrived the following morning and looked at the new table. She looked at Jack. "Consider it part of the arrangement," Jack said. "We haven't talked about an arrangement," she said. "We're talking about it now," he said. "You work here. You use the space, the equipment, whatever you need. In exchange, any chapter member who wants work done, you give them the same consideration you gave Roy." Madison looked at the table again. She looked around the back section, the space that was clearly, without being stated, being made into something. "I have outside clients now," she said. "Carla Jimenez, David Park. Others." "I know," Jack said. "They can come here. The space is here. The work is the work." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going to do flash work," she said. "I'm not going to do flames on demand or logo reproductions. If someone comes to me, it's because they have a real story and they want it told right." "I know that," Jack said. "That's why I cleared the space." She looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Jack was quiet for a second. not evasive considering. He was the kind of man who didn't like being imprecise about things that mattered. Because your father did good work for this chapter for years, and nobody ever gave him anything for it, he said. And because what you're doing is the same work he did just in a different medium, he paused. And because the men in this chapter are better when there's something worth paying attention to, and your work is worth paying attention to. Madison absorbed that. She set her bag on the new table. Okay, she said. It was the same word she'd given Roy, and it carried the same weight, not casual agreement, but the specific acceptance of something being offered in good faith by someone who meant it. She started setting up. Danny appeared from the front section with a second stool. Nobody had asked him to bring a stool. He set it down beside the work table. In case you need somewhere for clients to sit, he said, when they're talking. Madison looked at the stool. Thank you, Danny, she said. Danny nodded and went back to his work. His ears were red. He was 24 years old and he was learning in the specific way that young men learn things in environments where nobody lectures by watching what mattered and doing what he could to support it. For 3 weeks, the garage operated in this expanded mode. Madison worked 5 days. Her clients came and sat on the stool Danny had brought and talked to her while she listened. And then she painted, and the things she painted were true, in the way that true things are not perfect, not idealized, but accurate in the places that accuracy matters. Brandon Hayes stopped by every day. He didn't always say anything. Sometimes he just stood near the work table for a few minutes on his way from one part of the garage to another. But he stopped every day, without fail. One afternoon he said, my dad finally let me come up and see his bike. Madison was working on Carla Jimenez's tank, a complicated piece involving water, because Carla's story involved the ocean and a sister who had drowned when they were teenagers, and Madison was still working out how to put water on metal in a way that was honest rather than decorative. She looked up. How was it? She said. Old, Brandon said. The bike's old. He's kept it up, but it's old. How was your dad? Brandon was quiet. Old, he said again, and this time the word meant something completely different. Madison watched him. Did you ride it? She asked. He let me sit on it, Brandon said. Didn't run it, just sat on it in the garage. He paused. He put his hand on the handlebar while I was sitting on it. Didn't say anything, just stood there with his hand on the handlebar next to mine. Madison was very still. That's everything, she said quietly. Brandon looked at her. Yeah, he said, I know. He walked away. Madison looked at Carla's tank for a long time before she picked up her brush again. The business card that the man named Harris had left 3 weeks earlier, the one from Apex Customs out of Los Angeles, had been sitting in the corner of Madison's work table under a glass jar she used to hold brushes. She had not called the number. She had not thrown the card away. She had let it sit. Then a second card arrived. This one wasn't left by Harris. It was mailed to the garage, a formal envelope, good paper with the Apex Customs logo on it. Jack brought it back to Madison's work table and set it beside the first card without comment. She opened the envelope. The letter inside was professionally worded and carefully friendly. It expressed Apex Customs' admiration for her work, which, had the letter noted, attracted significant attention in the motorcycle community and beyond. It outlined in general terms an interest in discussing a partnership arrangement. It mentioned with great delicacy the distinctive artistic approach that characterized her work, and noted that Apex Customs had a particular interest in the design heritage represented in her portfolio. Design heritage. Madison read that phrase twice. She set the letter down. She picked up her brush. She worked for 2 more hours without speaking, and the work she did in those 2 hours was the best work she'd done all week, because something about the letter had made her angry in a clear, specific way, and that anger went into the painting in the particular way that strong emotion goes into work, when you know how to use it not to distort but to clarify, to push past the hesitation and the self-editing into the real thing underneath. Gene came to look at the work at the end of the day. He looked at Carla's tank, at the water that was finally doing what Madison needed it to do, suggesting depth and movement without becoming decorative, carrying the story without announcing it. That's different from anything you've done here, Gene said. Is it good different or different different? Madison asked. Gene looked at it for another moment. It's the best thing I've seen you do, he said, and I've been watching close. Madison looked at the tank. I was angry when I painted it, she said. Gene raised an eyebrow. She told him about the letter. Gene listened. He was quiet afterward for a moment. Then he said, What's design heritage? That's the question, Madison said. You think they mean your father's work? I think they're interested in calling it something they can license, she said. I think they saw the photographs that went around online, and they did some research, and they found enough to be interested in the marketable parts. Gene looked at the letter on the corner of the work table. You should tell Jack, he said. I know, she said. She told Jack that evening. Jack read the letter standing up, which was how Jack read things he was concerned about. He read it twice. He set it down on his desk. He said, what do you know about your father's designs, the specific ones, where they came from, when he made them, whether he documented them? Madison thought about this carefully. His shop records are in boxes, she said, at my aunt's house. I haven't gone through them. I haven't been able to. She paused. But he documented everything. He was careful that way. Dates, client names, reference photographs. He kept everything. Everything is going to matter, Jack said. The flatness of his tone told her he already understood something about the situation that she was just beginning to see. You think this is more than a licensing inquiry, she said. Jack looked at her steadily. I think the way that letter is written, he said, is the way letters are written by people who already think they have a claim to something and are giving you the courtesy of a friendly conversation before they tell you about it. The silence in the office was different from the silence in the garage. Smaller, more concentrated. Design heritage, Madison said. Yeah, Jack said. She sat with that for a moment. My father never registered anything formally, she said. He wasn't that kind of person. He just made things. That could be a problem, Jack said. Or it could be documented in 20 years of shop records and client photographs and dates that nobody can argue with, she said. Jack looked at her. For the first time since she'd walked into his garage 3 weeks earlier, he saw something in her face beyond the steadiness and the focus and the specific kind of quiet courage that kept showing up in every room she walked into. He saw something harder, something that had been growing under the surface while she painted and listened and responded and built something real in the back section of his garage. He saw her father in her, not in a soft, sentimental way, in the specific functional way that inheritance works when it goes deep enough, not a resemblance but a capacity. Tom Blake had been underneath the gentleness and the talent and the patience with machines and with people, a man who did not bend when someone tried to take what was his. Madison was Tom Blake's daughter. All right, Jack said. We'll deal with it. She said, I'm not going to let them have his work. No, Jack said. You're not. That night after the garage closed, Brandon Hayes found Jack in the office. He knocked on the open door. Jack looked up. Brandon said, I heard about the letter. News travels, Jack said. In this garage, it does. Brandon came in and sat down across from Jack's desk. What are we looking at? Jack told him what Madison had told him. Brandon listened without interrupting, which was not his usual approach to conversations. He was still when Jack finished. They're going to come after her father's designs, Brandon said. That's what it looks like. And she's alone in this. She's got the documentation if she can get to it, Jack said. And she's got us if it comes to that. Brandon looked at Jack. It's going to come to that, Brandon said. He said it simply, not dramatically. The way you state a fact about weather or road conditions, something that is coming and that you might as well name clearly so you can prepare. Jack nodded. Brandon stood up. He paused in the doorway. He said, that first day when she came in. Jack waited. I was going to make her leave, Brandon said. I had a whole speech ready about what this place was and who it was for and why she needed to find somewhere else. He paused. I want you to know that I know I was wrong about that. Jack looked at him. Yeah, Jack said. I know you know. Brandon nodded once. He walked out. Jack sat in his office for a while after Brandon left. He looked at the letter from Apex Customs on his desk. He looked at it for a long time, reading it again in his mind, thinking about the specific phrasing that Gene's question had already identified and that Madison had already understood, and that Jack had confirmed design heritage, and what that phrase implied about what Apex Customs thought they were walking into. They thought they were walking into a situation with a 22-year-old girl who was alone. Jack reached for his phone. He had a call to make. The chapter head, a lawyer, had used him twice in the last 10 years, both times when situations had arrived that required the careful deployment of documented truth in organized form. The lawyer's name was Sal Medina, and he was not easily surprised. Jack explained the situation. Sal listened. He said, "She needs to get those boxes tonight if possible. Everything her father kept, every dated record, every photograph. Before anything is formally filed by the other party, she needs her evidence organized and in front of me." Jack said, "I'll make sure she gets help." He hung up. He came out of the office. 4 men were still in the garage. He said, "We're going to Madison's aunt's house tonight. We're looking for boxes, shop records, photographs, anything Tom Blake kept from his work." Nobody asked why. Gene said what time, Jack said an hour. Frank Dawson, who had been quiet most of the day, stood up from his workbench. He said, "I know where the storage is at that house. I helped Tom move those boxes there after he got sick. I can get us to them fast." Jack looked at Frank. Frank had not spoken about Tom Blake before, not in the garage, not in any conversation Jack had been present for. The fact that he knew where the boxes were meant Frank and Tom had had something, a friendship, a quiet parallel existence, that neither of them had made public the way men sometimes have connections they don't announce. "All right," Jack said. He called Madison. She answered on the second ring. He said, "We're coming to help you get the boxes tonight." There was a pause. Then she said, "You don't have to do that." "I know," Jack said. "We're doing it anyway." Another pause. "Jack," she said. "Yeah." "He would have really liked you," she said. "If he'd known you better, he would have really liked all of you." Jack was quiet for a second. "He did know us," he said, "better than we knew." He hung up. The 4 men in the garage got ready to move. And in the boxes at Madison's aunt's house, in the careful dated records of a motorcycle mechanic and painter who had spent 18 years building something he believed in, was the evidence that was going to determine whether Tom Blake's legacy stayed in his daughter's hands or got absorbed into a company's portfolio and repackaged as something that had never been real. They didn't know yet exactly what they'd find, but they were going to find it. Madison's aunt lived 20 minutes from the garage in a house that had been in the family long enough that the address felt like a landmark rather than a location. Her name was Patricia Pat to everyone who knew her, and she was 61 years old and had spent the last 6 months doing what families do after loss, which is to say she had been holding things together for other people while quietly falling apart herself, and she had done it without complaint because that was how their family did things. She opened the door and found her niece on the porch with 5 Hells Angels behind her. Pat looked at Madison. Madison said, "Aunt Pat, these are friends. We need the boxes from Tom's shop." Pat looked at the 5 men. She looked at Jack, who was in the front. Jack had the particular quality of a man who understood that in this specific moment the right move was to wait and let the woman with the porch decide what happened next. Pat said, "You'd better come in." They came in. Pat led them through the house to the garage, her garage, the attached one that had been converted into storage years ago, and that now held, among other things, 12 bankers, boxes stacked against the far wall, all of them labeled in Tom Blake's handwriting, neat, precise, the handwriting of a man who organized his work because the work mattered. Frank went directly to them. He had helped Tom move those boxes 14 months ago, 3 weeks after the diagnosis, when Tom had started making the specific practical decisions that people make when they understand time has changed shape. Frank had carried 6 of those boxes himself. He knew which ones held the shop records because Tom had told him, and because Frank was the kind of man who paid close attention when people told him things that mattered to them. He pointed to 5 of the 12 boxes. "These," he said. Madison looked at Frank. She had known Frank Dawson by sight for 3 weeks. She had seen him stand in front of Roy's tank and remove his sunglasses. She had watched him drift toward her work table and drift away without saying much. She had understood that he was carrying something and that he moved around her work carefully because of it. She had not known he was one of the men who helped her father when Tom got sick. "Frank," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, the specific nod of a man who does not want thanks for something he would have done again in an instant regardless. They carried the boxes to Jack's truck and Jean's truck, and Pat stood in the garage doorway watching, and when the last box went out, she called Madison's name. Madison stopped. Pat said, "He knew this was going to happen." Madison turned. "What do you know about it?" "Tom talked to me," Pat said. 3 months before he died. He said there was work he'd done, designs he'd developed over the years, and that someday someone was going to try to claim them. He said he'd kept everything documented because he knew he'd need it. She paused. He said when that day came, he hoped you'd have people around you. Madison stood in the doorway. She looked at the 5 men loading boxes into trucks. She looked at her aunt. He planned for this, she said. He planned for you, Pat said. Everything he did for the last 20 years, he was planning for you, Pa. Madison looked at the ground for a moment. Then she looked up. I'll call you, she said. I know you will, Pat said. They drove back to the garage. Sal Medina arrived at 9:15. He was a compact man in his mid-50s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a lawyer's specific quality of patience, not passive, but the patience of someone who has learned that rushing through information costs more time than taking it carefully the first time. He shook Madison's hand and said, "Let's see what Tom left us." They opened the boxes at the chapter's back table. The records were better than any of them had expected. Tom Blake had kept everything, not haphazardly with system. Every design was dated, every client listed, every photograph taken before and after the work was done. Some entries had reference notes in Tom's handwriting, explaining where the concept came from, what the client had asked for, what Tom had added. There were carbon copies of receipts going back 18 years. There were small notebooks, the same kind Madison used, filled with sketch designs and dates, and the kind of marginal notes that a working artist makes when he's developing something new. Sal put on his reading glasses and started going through documents in a methodical silence. The men in the room let him work. Madison sat across from him. She was looking at the notebooks, specifically at the designs in them. Her father's hand, the specific way he turned a line, the shorthand he used for color notations, the small mark he made in the corner of a finished design that she had recognized immediately as the same practice she'd continued without quite knowing she was continuing it. She turned a page. She stopped. She looked at the design on that page for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Jack." Jack came over. She showed him the page. It was a design, a detailed one, more worked out than most of the sketches. An eagle in flight wings spread a specific position that was both powerful and somehow careful, like the bird was carrying something it didn't want to drop. Below it, a road. The composition was specific. The proportions were specific. The relationship between the eagle and the road and the horizon was specific. It was one of the designs featured in the Apex Customs letter. Not similar, not inspired by. The same design in Tom Blake's notebook dated 19 years ago. Sal looked at the page. He looked at the Apex Customs letter. He took off his reading glasses and held them in his hand. "How long ago did this company file?" he said. "The letter is from 3 weeks ago," Jack said. "No formal filing that we know of." "Then we're ahead of it," he said. He tapped the notebook. "This is prior art with dated documentation. If they've filed or are planning to file a design claim, this blows it apart. And if they haven't filed yet, this makes the claim impossible." Madison was looking at the notebook. "He knew," she said. "Sorry," Sal said. "My father knew this design was worth protecting," she said. "My aunt told me tonight that he said someone would come after it someday. He kept all of this because he knew." She looked at the notebook. "He just didn't know he wasn't going to be here to use it." The room was quiet. Jean, who was standing near the table, said, "He left it for you to use." Madison looked up at him. Jean looked at her steadily. "He documented everything and he put it in boxes and he made sure Frank knew where the boxes were," Jean said. "He wasn't just protecting his work. He was building you a case." The weight of that settled over Madison slowly and completely, the way understanding settles when it's real. Not the quick click of a simple answer, but the deeper shift of realizing that the ground you've been standing on was built deliberately by someone who loved you against the day you'd need it. Her father had spent 18 years building something, and then he'd spent his last months making sure she could defend it. She pressed her hand flat on the open notebook. She did not cry. She sat very still and she breathed, and she kept her hand on her father's drawings, and she let it be what it was. Nobody in that room said anything. Nobody moved. Sal Medina, who had spent 30 years in law and had sat across from people in some of the worst moments of their lives, looked at Madison Blake with her hand on her father's notebook and said nothing, which was the right thing. After a moment, Madison looked up. Her eyes were clear. "What do we need to do?" she said. Sal straightened his papers. "We need to organize and photograph every relevant document tonight," he said. "I need to run dates against the Apex Customs corporate filing history, and I need to know—" He looked at Madison. "Is there anyone who was a client of Tom's who can testify to the date they received work with these designs? An actual person who can say, 'I had this done in this year by Tom Blake,'" Madison thought. "Roy Garrett," she said immediately. "He had work done at my father's shop. And there are records here." She reached for a box and found the right one quickly, with the instinct of someone who had grown up around a man's filing system and internalized its logic. She found the file. Roy Garrett, 4 entries across 8 years, each with dated receipts and a description of work performed. Sal looked at the file. He nodded. "Who else?" he said. Madison kept going through the files. She found 14 names over the next 40 minutes. 14 clients who had commissioned specific work from Tom Blake at specific dates, work that included the designs Apex Customs was interested in claiming. Some of those clients were people Madison knew. Some were names she didn't recognize. Some were in states she hadn't known her father's work had reached. With each name, she found something in the room's atmosphere shifted slightly. From the uncertainty of an evening where they had arrived at a house with boxes and hope to the specific confidence of people who realize the evidence is better than they feared. Brandon found the photograph at 11:40. He had been going through the third box, the one that had physical photographs, rather than documents, sorting them into categories and making notes of dates on their backs. He had done this methodically and without complaint for 2 hours, which was not a description of Brandon Hayes that most people in the chapter would have predicted possible. He found the photograph and he held it under the light. Then he said, "Madison." She came over. The photograph was dated on the back in Tom's handwriting. It showed a motorcycle tank, a completed piece, the paint fresh and sharp in the photo. The design on the tank was the eagle, the same eagle. The wings spread in that specific, careful way, the horizon below it, the road composition that was so particular you couldn't mistake it. The date on the back was 21 years ago. Madison stared at it. 21 years ago, she had been 1 year old. Her father had developed this design before she could walk. Brandon was watching her face. "That's not a sketch," he said. "That's the finished piece. Dated." "With the client name," Sal called from across the table. Brandon flipped to the front of the box folder the photograph had been in. Client name, date, description, all there. "Got it," Brandon said. He brought the folder to Sal. Sal looked at the dated photograph and the client record. He put his reading glasses back on. He looked at everything for a full minute. Then he said, "They don't have a case." The room went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Not the silence of weight, the silence of pressure releasing. "They never had a case," Sal continued. "What they had was the assumption that a young artist working alone wouldn't be able to document a dead man's 20-year career quickly enough to stop them." He set the photograph down. "They were wrong about that." Jack said, "What's the next step?" "I file a preemptive documentation of prior art Monday morning," Sal said. "Everything we found tonight goes into that filing. The photographs, the dated records, the client names, the notebooks, every piece of it. Once that's filed, any claim Apex makes is dead on arrival." He looked at Madison. "They may still try. Companies like this sometimes pursue things even when the evidence is against them because they're hoping the other party will run out of money or patience. But with what we have tonight, the only question is how long they want to spend losing." Madison absorbed this. She looked at the table covered with her father's records, 21 years of careful documentation, boxes of evidence that a man had built while building motorcycles, while building his shop, while building his daughter. "He won this case," she said, "years ago. He just didn't know what case it was yet." Nobody argued with that. Sal left at midnight with a briefcase full of copied documents and a list of things he needed from Madison before Monday. The men stayed another hour reorganizing the boxes and making sure the originals were accounted for and stored safely. Jean drove to the garage and came back with a fireproof lockbox that had been in the office storage. Jack put the most critical originals in it. Frank Dawson, who had been quiet for most of the night, working steadily, sorting carefully the way he did everything, found Madison near the end of the evening when the others were starting to pack up. He said, "I need to tell you something." She looked at it on. "Your father," he said. "Now, the last time I saw him." He stopped. He started again. I went to see him in the hospital about 3 weeks before he died. I went because Tom and we didn't talk a lot publicly, but he'd been there for me after my son, more than most people. He showed up, not with words. He just showed up and stayed nearby, and it helped more than anything else anyone did. Madison listened. I went to the hospital and he was having a clear day, Frank said. Good day. We talked for about an hour, and he asked me if I would do something for him. Frank looked at Madison steadily. He asked me to keep an eye on you, not in a watch over her she can't handle herself way. He was specific. He said Madison knows what she's doing. He said she's going to walk into places that feel too big for her, and she's going to be right about them, and sometimes the only thing she'll need is someone nearby who believes that. Madison was very still. Frank said, I told him I would. Madison didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, the boxes. Yeah, Frank said, you kept them organized. You knew exactly where they were. I checked on them every couple of months, he said. Made sure they were dry, made sure the labels were still clear. He paused. Tom asked me to. Madison looked at Frank Dawson, this quiet, specific man who had lost his son and said almost nothing about it and had been a presence in her peripheral vision for 3 weeks. Never intrusive, always nearby. He was building a team for me, she said. He was doing what fathers do. Frank said simply, when they understand they were running out of time. She stood with that for a long time. Then she said, Frank, I want to paint something for you, not as payment, just I want to. Frank looked at her. You don't have to do that, he said. I know, she said. Your son's name. Frank's breath came out slowly. Marcus, he said. Marcus James Dawson. Okay, she said. He nodded. He walked away. The following Monday, Sal Medina filed the prior art documentation. Tuesday, Apex Customs received formal notice. Wednesday, the company's lawyer called Sal. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Sal called Jack afterward. They're withdrawing inquiry, he said. No formal claim will be filed. They're citing internal review of their documentation process. Jack said, meaning they knew they were wrong and they're finding a way to exit without admitting it. That's what internal review of their documentation process means, yes, Sal said. Jack hung up and walked to the back section of the garage where Madison was working on a new piece. A commission from a woman in San Bernardino who had ridden from San Diego specifically because she'd seen the photographs of Roy's tank online and couldn't stop thinking about them. He said, it's over. Madison set her brush down. She looked at Jack. They're withdrawing, he said. No claim. Sal's confirmed it. She looked at the painting in front of her. The new work, the commission, the story of a woman she'd met 3 days ago and was already trying to understand well enough to tell. She picked her brush back up. Okay, she said. Jack waited. She kept working. That's it, he said. What else should there be, she said. Most people would, I don't know. Celebrate, react. Madison mixed a color. He already won it, she said. 21 years ago when he dated that photograph and wrote down the client's name. I just had to find it. She applied the color to the tank. The only thing that happened Monday was the world catching up to what he already made sure was true. Jack stood there for a moment. Then he said, Brandon wants to know if you'll do his father's Sportster. Madison's brush stopped. She looked up. Brandon asked, she said. He came into my office this morning, Jack said. He said, and I'm quoting here, I need her to paint my dad's bike before my dad is too old to ride it. Jack paused. He also said to tell you he was sorry for what he said the first day. He didn't say anything that bad, Madison said. He said, you think you can walk into a Hells Angels garage and decorate our bikes, Jack said. Madison looked back at her work. He was asking a real question, she said. He just didn't know the answer yet. She looked up at Jack. Tell Brandon I'll do his father's bike, she said. And tell him the answer to his question was yes. Jack almost smiled. He went to tell Brandon. The commission for Brandon's father's Sportster became something that nobody in the chapter had anticipated. Brandon arranged for his father, his actual father, a 71-year-old man named Harold Hayes, who had lived in Fontana his entire life, to come to the garage and talk to Madison before she started the work. Harold arrived on a Thursday morning. He was a smaller man than his son, which people in the chapter found surprising. And he moved slowly but with the particular deliberateness of men who have spent their lives doing physical work and have learned to make every movement count. He had Harold's same dark eyes but without the edge in them, or rather, the edge had softened over decades into something that looked more like attention. He sat on Danny's stool. Madison sat across from him. They talked for nearly 2 hours. Harold talked about riding when he started, why he started, the specific feeling that he still couldn't explain in 50 years of trying to explain it, the quality of freedom that wasn't about escape, but about presence, about being exactly where you were with nothing between you and the road. He talked about Brandon. He said Brandon was hard to reach and always had been, that some people came into the world already armored, and the job of being their parent was finding the small gaps in the armor where things could get in and trusting that they would. He said he thought the Sportster was one of the gaps. Madison listened to all of it without writing anything down. When Harold was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Harold, when you picture the best ride you ever had on that bike, the specific one that you go back to if you could, where are you?" Harold didn't hesitate. "Highway 18, he said, 1981, early morning. Brandon was 7 years old. He was on the back because his mother was having a hard time, and I didn't have anyone to leave him with, so I put him on the back. He wasn't supposed to be on that bike. He was too small. But I strapped him on as safe as I could, and we rode out to Big Bear and back, and he didn't say one word the whole time." Harold stopped. "When we got home and I took him off the bike, he looked at me and said, 'Again?' And I said, 'Not today.' And he said, 'Tomorrow.' And I said, 'Maybe.' And he said," Harold's voice went unsteady for just a second. He said, "I'll be ready." The back section of the garage was completely silent. Danny, who was on his crate, had stopped moving entirely. Gene had put down a tool he'd been using and forgotten about it. Brandon Hayes was standing in the doorway between the front and back sections of the garage. He was standing very still. Madison did not look at Brandon. She kept her eyes on Harold. She said quietly, "Did you take him again?" Harold said, "Every weekend that summer." Brandon made a sound in the doorway that he immediately controlled, but it was there, short, involuntary, the sound of someone taking a breath that came out differently than expected. He walked away from the doorway. Harold didn't see it, or if he did, he let it be what it was. Madison started on the Sportster 2 days later. She worked on it for 5 days. When it was done, she called Harold. He came on a Saturday morning with Brandon driving him because Harold's eyesight had gotten to the point where he didn't drive on the freeway anymore, which was something Harold and Brandon had negotiated in the specific, difficult way that parents and children negotiate the reversals of care. Harold came into the back section. He stood in front of his Sportster. He was quiet for a long time. What Madison had painted was the highway. Not a generic highway, Highway 18, as specifically as she could render a road she'd never driven with her own hands, but had heard described in enough detail that she understood it. The early morning light, and on the back of the bike suggested, rather than detailed, the shape of a small figure, a child arm slightly out in the posture of someone discovering balance and speed, at the same moment the posture of a 7-year-old on the back of a motorcycle, on a morning in 1981, saying a word that meant everything without knowing it meant everything. "Ready." Harold looked at the painting. He put his hand over his mouth. Brandon was standing 4 feet behind his father. He was looking at the child in the painting. He was looking at the specific posture of the small figure, the arms slightly out, the particular angle that was both nervous and trusting at the same time, and his face was doing something that Brandon's face almost never did. It was open, completely, entirely open. Harold turned around. He looked at his son. He said, "That's you." Brandon couldn't speak. He nodded. Harold reached out and put his hand on Brandon's arm. They stood there together like that, the father and the son, and the motorcycle with the painting of the morning they both remembered. And the garage was so quiet that you could hear the street outside, the distant, ordinary sounds of a regular Saturday in Riverside, California, the world going about its business while something important happened in a garage on a side street. Madison had stepped back to the far end of the work table. She was watching Harold and Brandon. Danny on his crate looked at Madison. His eyes were bright. He opened his mouth and then closed it because there was nothing to say that wouldn't be smaller than the moment. Gene picked up his tool. He set it down again. Harold said eventually, "She painted me too." Brandon looked at the bike again. Ahead of the child figure in the foreground, hands on handlebars, the posture of a man in motion watching what was behind him and what was ahead at the same time was the father. Brandon looked at the hands on the handlebars. The hands that had strapped him on safely enough and driven carefully enough and known instinctively the right speed for a morning in 1981, with a 7-year-old on the back saying words he didn't fully understand yet. Brandon looked at his father's actual hands. Harold's hands at 71 had the specific quality of hands that had worked for decades. Strong and deliberate, and slightly bent now at the knuckles. The same hands. Brandon said quietly, "Dad." Harold looked at him. Brandon said, "I was always ready." Harold's breath went out slowly. He said, "I know you were." That was the moment, not the case that had been filed and won, not the photographs that had traveled across the internet, not the first tank Madison had painted in 2 hours to prove she belonged in that room. That moment in the quiet back section of the Hells Angels Riverside chapter garage, between a father and a son, in a painting that found the true thing and said it clearly enough to be heard, was the moment that the men in that chapter understood what Madison Blake had actually brought into their lives. Not decoration, not talent even. Truth. The small, hard, necessary truth that people carry for years without being able to say, and that sometimes with the right person and the right tools and the right moment finds its way into paint on metal where it can be seen clearly for the first time. Jack Ryder, standing near the office doorway, looked at Harold and Brandon and the motorcycle between them. He looked at Madison. She was already cleaning her brushes, already preparing for the next piece, already moving in the specific, quiet way of someone who understands that the work is the gift and the response is the confirmation, and you don't need to stay in the moment you created because the moment stands on its own. Jack thought about what Roy had said 3 weeks ago standing in front of his son's painting. "She painted me too." He thought about what Frank had told him Tom Blake had said in the hospital. "She knows what she's doing." He thought about the first day the side door opening and the silence going dangerous. 68 men turning around and that 22-year-old woman with paint on her hands and a worn canvas bag walking in like she had an appointment. She had. She just hadn't known yet what the appointment was for. 3 days after Harold Hayes stood in front of his Sportster and told his son he knew he was always ready, Madison came to the garage and found something she hadn't expected. The work table was gone. Not removed, expanded. Someone had taken the wide table Jack had cleared for her 6 weeks earlier and extended it with a second table bolted flush against the first, doubling the workspace. Above the tables, someone had mounted a strip of track lighting, not garage lighting, not the harsh overhead fluorescent kind, but the warm directed kind that painters use when they need to see color accurately. A new tool cabinet stood to the right, smaller than the chapter's main ones, stocked with the specific supplies she used most. Her brush cases, her paint bottles, her cleaning materials, all of it organized with a care that she recognized as the care of people who had been watching how she worked and had paid close attention. She stood in the doorway between the front and back sections. Danny was leaning against the wall nearby with the expression of someone trying very hard not to look pleased with himself. She said, "Who did this?" Danny said, "Collaborative effort." She looked at him. He said, "Brandon found the lights, Gene did the electrical, Frank built the extension for the table. Roy donated the cabinet, he said it was the least he could do, and then he argued with everyone about where it should go for 45 minutes. He paused. Jack supervised. Madison looked at the workspace. It was without anyone having consulted her about it exactly what she would have built if she'd designed it herself. She set her bag down on the new surface. She ran her hand along the tabletop, smooth level, properly finished. She said, "Tell them thank you." Danny said, "Tell them yourself. They were all pretending to work about 15 feet behind you." She turned around. Gene was at his bench with a socket wrench he'd been holding in the same position for too long to be actually using it. Frank was standing near the parts wall, studying a label that was too far away to read comfortably. Roy, who had apparently come by specifically for this, was sitting in a chair near the back with a coffee cup and the unconvincing posture of a man who just happened to be there. Brandon was at his stool, his permanent stool, now the one that lived beside her work table by unspoken agreement, looking at his phone with the slightly rigid focus of a man pretending the phone is interesting. Madison looked at all of them. She said, "Thank you." Roy raised his coffee cup. Gene nodded. Frank said, "The table extension has a slight variance at the joint. I'm going to fix that." Brandon said without looking up from his phone, "It's fine, Frank." Frank said, "It's a 16th of an inch off level." Brandon said, "She paints motorcycles, not floors." Gene said he's been upset about the joint since Tuesday. Frank said, "Because it's not right." Madison smiled. It was the first time most of them had seen her actually smile, not the contained, steady expression she wore when she worked, not the quiet warmth she had when someone told her a story she needed to understand, but an actual smile open and real and surprised out of her by five grown men arguing about a 16th of an inch. Danny looked at the smile and then looked at the ceiling. His ears went red. Jack came out of the office and saw Madison at the new workspace and said, "Good, you're here. I need to talk to you." The smile stayed on her face for a second, and then her expression shifted to the attentive, steady quality she had when something was actually happening. She followed Jack to the office. He closed the door. He said, "Sal called this morning. Apex Customs isn't the only company that's been looking at your work." She sat down. Jack sat across from her. "There are 3 other companies," he said. 2 of them are legitimate galleries, essentially, that work with custom artists and handle licensing in ways that actually benefit the artist. Sal has relationships with both. He says they're worth talking to." He paused. "The third is more complicated." Madison waited. "It's not a company," Jack said. "It's a foundation, a nonprofit that works with grieving families, specifically with memorial commissions. They help families fund artwork for people who've lost someone, custom work memorial pieces. They've been doing it for 4 years. He set a folder on the desk. They saw Roy's tank online, and they saw the photograph of the open hand in the shadow that circulated separately. And they want to know if you'd be interested in being one of their commissioned artists. Madison looked at the folder. She didn't open it yet. "A foundation," she said. "They fund the work," Jack said. "The families get the memorial piece. The artist gets paid fairly. The foundation's charter is specifically about ensuring that grief gets treated with—" He glanced at a note Sal had left, "artistic dignity." Their words. Madison was quiet. "That's what my father would have wanted," she said. "I know," Jack said. She opened the folder. She read for a few minutes. Jack waited. She looked up. "There's a family in it," she said. "Already listed. The foundation flagged a specific commission. A mother in San Diego. She lost her husband 2 years ago. He rode. He had a bike that's been sitting in their garage, and she doesn't know what to do with it. She can't sell it, and she can't look at it, and she can't— Madison stopped reading the description. She knew the rest of it without reading it. She'd heard versions of that sentence more times in the last 6 weeks than she'd expected. "She wants something on it that lets her look at it again." Jack said nothing. Madison closed the folder. "Okay," she said. She said it differently than she'd said it to Roy and to Brandon and to Jack's offer of the workspace. Quieter, more weight to it. The okay of someone accepting something that is larger than the immediate arrangement. Jack looked at her. "This is going to change the scale of what you do," he said carefully. "Not as a warning, as information. Right now you're working with people who come to you. This starts sending you to them. Different cities, different circumstances. You'd need to think about whether the work survives being that mobile." Madison thought about her father, his shop on Magnolia. 18 years in one place, clients coming to him. The work had survived in that form. But she also thought about the man who'd brought his wife's gardening hands to her father's garage, and the woman who'd come from San Diego, and Roy calling from the road somewhere outside Barstow, and the foundation in front of her, with a mother in San Diego who couldn't look at her husband's motorcycle. The work was already going places. She said, "My father built a place and people came to him. I think I built differently." Jack held her gaze. "Yeah," he said, "I think you do." She picked up the folder. She walked back to the workspace. Frank was under the table with a level addressing the joint. She set the folder on the new surface. She opened her bag. She started setting up for the morning's work the commission from a man in Rancho Cucamonga, who had been referred by Roy, who had been referred by a woman who had seen the photograph online in the specific chain of connection that had been building since Roy posted 3 pictures on a forum 3 weeks ago. Danny was on his crate. He looked at her face when she came back. "Good meeting," he said. "Yes," she said. "You going somewhere?" She looked at him. "Eventually," she said. "Not yet." He nodded. Brandon, who had been listening without appearing to listen, said, "You're not going anywhere until you do the piece for the chapter wall." Madison looked at him. "What piece for the chapter wall?" she said. "The one Jack is going to ask you about." Brandon said, "After he finishes convincing himself, it's not too much to ask." From the office, Jack's voice came through the closed door with a tone of pure dignity. "I can hear you, Brandon." Brandon said to Madison, He's going to ask you to paint something for the wall, the main wall in the front section. Something for the chapter. Madison looked at the closed office door. She looked at Brandon. What does the chapter want? She said. Brandon thought about it. Something true, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Okay, she said. She turned to her current commission and picked up her brush. She had been working for 20 minutes when she heard the front door of the garage open and a voice she didn't recognize. A woman's voice, asking for Madison Blake. Danny got up from his crate and went to the front section. She heard a brief exchange and then Danny came back. There's a woman out front, he said. She says she saw Roy's tank at a show. She doesn't have a commission or anything specific. She said she just needed to see the person who made it. Madison set down her brush. She went to the front section. The woman was 63. She had the kind of face that had been beautiful in a particular way when she was young and had become something better with age, more specific, more itself. She was holding her hands together in front of her, the way people hold their hands when they're not sure what to do with them. She said, "Are you Madison?" Madison said, "Yes." The woman said, "Hey, I don't need anything painted. She stopped. She started again. My husband died 4 years ago. He rode for 40 years, and I didn't even know what I was looking for. And then someone showed me a photograph of your painting, the one with the hand in the shadow." She paused. "I cried for an hour. I didn't know I still had an hour of crying left in me. I thought I'd used it all up." She looked at Madison. "I just wanted to say thank you to whoever made that." Madison looked at this woman, this 63-year-old woman who had driven to a garage in Riverside because a photograph of a painting had unlocked something she'd thought was sealed. She said, "What was his name?" The woman blinked. "Robert," she said. "What kind of bike?" "A Softail," she said. He had a name for it. He called it the Runner because it never quit on him. In 30 years, that bike never quit." Madison looked at her for a moment. "Do you still have the Runner?" she said. The woman's eyes filled. "Yes," she said. "Bring it," Madison said. "Whenever you're ready. There's no rush. But when you're ready, bring it." The woman pressed her lips together. She nodded. She reached out and took Madison's hand, both of Madison's hands, and held them for a second. She looked at Madison's hands the way people look at things they want to understand, trying to see the mechanism of something that seems like more than mechanism. She let go. She walked out. Danny was standing 6 feet behind Madison. He said very quietly, "That's going to keep happening." Madison looked at the door. "I know," she said. She went back to work. The piece for the chapter wall took Madison 2 weeks. She didn't rush it, and nobody asked her to. The chapter had given her the wall, the main interior wall of the front section, the one you faced when you walked through the front entrance, the one that had held nothing but a faded calendar and a clock that hadn't worked in 3 years. And she worked on it in the evenings after her commission work was done, in the specific hours when the garage was quieter and she could hear herself think. She didn't tell anyone what she was painting. She covered the wall with canvas and worked behind it, which was her right and which nobody disputed. Even Brandon, who would have disputed almost anything if given the opportunity. Even he understood that some work needed privacy while it was becoming itself. On the 14th evening, she took the canvas down. She did it at 7 o'clock when most of the chapter was still present. She didn't announce it. She simply removed the canvas and stepped back. The front section of the Hells Angels Riverside chapter garage went silent. The painting was large, the full width of the wall floor to ceiling at the center. It showed a road, not a dramatic road, not an idealized road, a real road. The specific texture of a road that has been ridden, that has weather on it, that exists in the world and not just in paintings of the world. The road went from the lower corners of the wall to the center, and then continued upward, which was not physically realistic and was emotionally perfect. The road going somewhere that wasn't just the horizon, but was beyond. It was more than could be framed. On the road were riders, not stylized, not heroic, not posed riding, the specific posture of people on motorcycles who are not performing riding but doing it. And each rider was different. Each one had specific quality, a particular way of sitting, a particular something that marked them as themselves and not interchangeable figures. Roy, who was present, looked at one of the riders and went still. He walked closer. The rider in the middle distance ahead of the others, always ahead, had a specific posture that Roy knew. The way the shoulders sat, the angle of the head, the particular forward lean of someone who always had somewhere to be. Roy put his hand on his chest. He didn't speak. Frank was looking at another part of the painting. Near the back of the group of riders, smaller, suggested rather than rendered a younger figure. Not a rider yet, someone just beginning. The posture of someone learning, the posture of a boy. Frank's jaw worked. He turned away and turned back. Jean was looking at the sky above the road. In the sky, working with the light in a way that was subtle enough that you might see it differently each time you looked something. Not quite a shape, not quite a figure. The suggestion of presence, the way absence sometimes looks when you've loved someone long enough. Jean didn't say what he saw, but he looked at it for a long time. Brandon was looking at a rider near the front of the group. A rider with a specific seat, the way someone sits on a bike when they've been riding since before they decided to, since before it was a choice, since it was just something that happened on a Saturday morning in 1981 with their father's hands on the handlebars. Brandon stood in front of that part of the painting for 2 minutes without moving. Then he looked at Madison. She was standing to the side watching the chapter look at the wall with the specific expression she had when she was doing something she did not have words for, the alert, still quality of someone completely present. Brandon said, "How did you fit all of us in there?" She said, "You were all already there. I just found you." He looked back at the painting. He said, "The one in front, the one who's always ahead." She looked at that figure. Roy's son, the shape of someone who had somewhere to be. "Yes," she said. Brandon said, "Mine's the one learning to balance." She said, "Wait." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "My dad needs to see this." She said, "I know. I called Harold yesterday. He's coming Saturday." Brandon looked at her. She looked back at him steadily. He said, "You called him before you took the canvas down." "He's in the painting," she said. "He should see it before anyone else." Brandon's expression did the thing it had been doing more often in the last 6 weeks it opened. The armor that he'd been building since he was the kind of boy who needed armor went somewhere briefly, and what was underneath was not what most people would have expected. It was someone who had been waiting for a very long time to be seen accurately. "Thank you," he said. "Your father talks about you like you're the best thing he ever did," she said. "I painted what he told me." Brandon turned back to the wall. He looked at the small figure learning to balance. He looked at the rider near the front whose hands on the handlebars had the quality of certainty and care simultaneously. He said quietly to the painting, "Hey, Dad." Nobody acted like they heard it, but everyone did. Harold Hayes came on Saturday morning. Brandon drove him. They came through the front entrance and Harold stopped. He stood in the entrance for a long moment. He looked at the wall. He found himself in it without being told where to look. That was what Madison had counted on, the way people find themselves in true things without needing a guide. He found the rider with the child behind him. The early morning light that was Highway 18 in 1981 translated into paint on a wall in a garage in Riverside. The child with his arms slightly out, the father's hands certain and careful on the bars. Harold said, "That's the morning." Brandon said, "Yeah." Harold said, "She put it on the wall." Brandon said, "She puts things where they can be seen." Harold looked at his son. He put his hand on Brandon's arm. He said, "You turned out right." Brandon didn't say anything. He put his hand over his father's. They stood like that. And that was the moment, not one moment, because there had been so many of them. But this was one of them, when a garage that had been built on loyalty and history and brotherhood was suddenly also built on something that didn't have a chapter name, but was just as structural. The thing that happens when you give someone the room to say a true thing about what they love and who they are, and trust that the room is strong enough to hold it. Madison was at her work table when Harold and Brandon came in. She let them have the wall without going to them. The work had been done. What happened between a father and a son in front of a painting was theirs, not hers. Danny came to stand near her. He said, "I've been thinking about something." She kept working. "You were looking for work when you came here," he said. "Was that true? Like actually you needed the money?" Madison mixed a color. "My dad left me the van and his tools and a shop lease I couldn't keep paying," she said. "I had $340 in my account and a portfolio and 13 years of knowing how to do one thing well." She applied the color to the tank she was working on. "So yes, I needed work." Danny absorbed this. "And you walked into here," he said. "I walked into 12 other places first," she said. Custom shops, dealerships, 2 galleries. Nobody was interested. She kept painting. This was the last place on my list. I almost didn't come. I sat in the van in the parking lot for 20 minutes. Danny stared at her. You sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before you came in. Yes. And then you walked in like you owned the place. She looked up at him. I walked in like I had something real, she said. That's different from owning the place. Owning the place is about power. Having something real is about it's just true. You walk differently when you're carrying something true. Danny looked at the wall, at the painting, at Roy, who was standing in front of the rider-ahead figure with his coffee going cold in his hand, which had been Roy's consistent relationship with coffee since the tank was unveiled. Danny said, what if they'd thrown you out the first day? Then I would have found somewhere else, she said. But your dad's work was still real, she said. It would have still been real somewhere else. Truth doesn't need the right room. It just needs one room eventually. Danny sat on his crate. He sat there for a while. Then he said, I want to learn. She stopped painting. She looked at him. He met her eyes. Not to be you, he said quickly. I know I don't have what you have. But I want to learn what I can learn about looking at things the way you look at them, about finding the story before you start. He paused. I've been sitting on this crate for 6 weeks watching you work, and I think there's something in it for me. I don't know what exactly, but something. Madison looked at him for a long moment. She set her brush in the cleaning jar. She moved Danny's crate to the side of the work table, not across from her, beside her. The position you put someone in when you're going to show them something, not just describe it. She put a blank piece of metal on the table in front of him. She said, before you paint anything, you listen. Tell me, what do you know about the person this commission is for? Danny looked at the blank metal. He thought about what he'd heard over the last week. He started talking. Madison listened. It was the first lesson. A month later, Madison received a call from the foundation. The mother in San Diego, the woman with the motorcycle she couldn't look at, was ready. Madison drove down on a Tuesday morning. The woman's name was Carol. She was 58. She had a house near the coast and a garage where her husband's bike had been covered with a sheet for 2 years. She took Madison to the garage, and she stood in the doorway, and she said, I can't go in there yet. Madison said, that's okay. She went in alone. She stood with the bike for a while. She uncovered it. She walked around it. She put her hand on the tank, and she listened. She came back to the doorway where Carol was standing. She said, tell me about him. Carol talked for an hour. She talked about a man named David who had ridden for 32 years and who had never been able to explain what riding meant to him, but who always came home from a long ride with something settled in him that wasn't there when he left. She talked about the way he looked in the morning when he was going out on the bike versus the way he looked every other morning of the year, the specific aliveness of a person doing the thing that makes them most themselves. She talked about the last ride he took 6 weeks before he died, when he came home and came inside and found her in the kitchen and held her for a long time without saying anything. She said, I think he knew. I think he went out that day because he knew, and he came back and he held me and he didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that was better than just being there. Madison was very still. She said, he came back. Carol said, yes. Madison said, that's what I'm going to paint. Carol looked at her. Him coming back, she said. Him coming home, Madison said. The return, not the ride, the moment when the ride is done and he's back, and he's himself, the most himself he ever got, and you're there. Carol's breath came out unsteady. She said, I never thought about it that way. Everyone always talks about the going, the freedom, the road. Her voice dropped. But he always came back. He always came back, Madison confirmed. She worked on that tank for 6 days. When she unveiled it for Carol in the garage, just the two of them, no audience because Carol had asked for privacy, and Madison understood privacy, Carol looked at the painting for a long time. Then she walked up to the bike and put both hands on it. She stood there with her hands on her husband's motorcycle that she hadn't been able to touch in 2 years. She said, I can look at it. Madison said, I know. Carol looked at her. She said, how did you know that was what I needed? Madison thought about her father, about the last painting she had of his hands in the shop, about the van in the parking lot outside the garage with $340 in her account and a portfolio, about Roy's son, always out ahead, and Brandon's father's hand on the handlebar in 1981, and Frank's Marcus and a woman named Carol who had been waiting 2 years for permission to walk into her own garage. She said, "My father taught me that every machine has a story, that the job isn't to put something pretty on metal. The job is to find what's already there." She looked at the painting, at the rider coming home, at the quality of homecoming in every line of the figure, at the specific light that was the light of return rather than departure. "The story was yours," she said. "I just found it where it was." 1 year after Madison Blake walked through the side door of the Hells Angels Riverside chapter garage with paint on her hands and a worn canvas bag and a paintbrush behind her ear, the main wall of that garage held a painting that made grown men go quiet. The back section held a workspace built by 5 men who'd watched carefully enough to know what she needed. The stool beside her work table had a permanent occupant learning to listen before he painted. The foundation had 7 families waiting. Carol had walked into her garage every morning for 3 months and put her hands on the runner and stood there with her husband's story underneath her palms. And Madison Blake, 23 now, still with paint on her hands, still carrying a worn canvas bag, still with a paintbrush behind her ear, went to work every morning knowing what her father had always known. That the quietest person in the room is often carrying the loudest truth. That the smallest tool can move the heaviest thing. That the story is always already there inside whatever you're looking at, waiting for someone patient enough and brave enough and present enough to find it. Tom Blake had spent 18 years teaching his daughter how to look. She had spent 1 year proving that she had learned. And every motorcycle that left that garage with her work on it carried the proof forward into the world, into every road and every rider and every person who looked at the machine and felt without knowing why that the thing they were looking at was somehow looking back. That was the gift. That had always been the gift. And now it belonged to everyone who was brave enough to ask for it and patient enough to wait for the truth and willing to walk through whatever doors stood between them and the story they needed to tell.